I kissed a man at my own engagement party and didn't realize until 3 seconds later that it wasn't my fiancé. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for my entire life to unravel. His name was Sawyer Voss, though I didn't know that yet. I didn't know anything about him, except that he smelled like cedar and something darker underneath, and that when I turned to find Jonah in the crowd and reached up on my tiptoes to press my lips against his cheek, the man who turned toward me wasn't Jonah at all. He didn't pull away. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. He didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't say a word. He just looked at me, this slow, measured look, like he was cataloging every detail of my face, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a way that made my stomach drop to the floor. "You might want to try that again," he said, "with the right person." I took 3 steps backward and knocked into a waiter carrying champagne flutes. 2 of them hit the marble floor. The sound cracked through the entire room like a gunshot, and every head in that ballroom turned toward me, including Jonah's. He was standing 15 feet away, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching. I need to back up. My name is Sloane. I was 29 years old. I worked in architectural preservation for a nonprofit in Philadelphia, and I had been with Jonah Voss for 2 years before he asked me to marry him at a rooftop restaurant in Old City on a Thursday night in October. The ring was a vintage Art Deco piece with a cushion-cut diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires. I cried. He laughed at me for crying, in the warm way he always did when I got emotional at things I pretended not to care about. I loved Jonah. I want to be clear about that. He was steady and kind, and he remembered things. The anniversary of my mother's death, the name of the barista at my regular coffee shop, the way I could never sleep when there was a full moon unless the curtains were completely closed. He paid attention. After a long string of men who didn't, Jonah felt like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. His family was old Philadelphia money. His father, Randall Voss, had made a fortune in commercial real estate development, the kind of wealth that had been growing quietly for 3 generations and didn't need to announce itself. Jonah worked in the family business but on his own terms, managing the historic preservation division, which was actually how we'd met. Our nonprofit had partnered with Voss Properties on a renovation project in Germantown, and Jonah had been the one to sit across from me at the first planning meeting and ask questions that showed he'd actually read our proposal. The engagement party was his mother's idea. Catherine Voss was the kind of woman who organized everything with a smile so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine warmth. She booked the entire 3rd floor of a hotel in Center City, hired a florist from New York, and had personally selected the menu. I had shown up in a dress I'd bought on sale and spent 45 minutes trying to do my own hair. And the moment I walked in, I understood that nothing about this evening was going to be casual. There were 200 people there. I knew maybe 20 of them. Jonah had been pulled away early in the evening by his father and a cluster of men in very expensive suits, and he'd squeezed my hand before he left and mouthed, "I'm sorry," with such genuine regret that I'd waved him off and told myself I was fine. I was fine. I was going to walk around this room and make conversation, and be the kind of person who was comfortable at parties like this, because that was the person I was choosing to be now. By 9 o'clock I'd had 2 glasses of champagne and made successful small talk with Jonah's aunt, his college roommate, and a woman named Patricia who turned out to be on the board of a museum I'd done consulting work for. It was going fine, genuinely fine. I spotted Jonah near the bar, or at least, I thought I did. The same dark hair, same height, same build in a dark suit. His back was mostly to me. I crossed the room, feeling the easy warmth of the champagne, thinking I would slide up beside him and say something quietly embarrassing and make him laugh. Because that was the kind of shorthand we'd built, and I missed him. And I just wanted a minute with him before this whole evening swallowed us both again. I came up on his right side. I raised myself up and pressed my lips to his cheek, and he turned, not Jonah's face, sharper, older by a few years. The same dark hair but worn slightly longer, the same jaw but with a scar running through the left eyebrow that Jonah didn't have. Eyes so similar in color they could have been the same pair, except there was something in them I had never once seen in Jonah's. Something careful and a little cold and absolutely, completely aware of exactly what had just happened. "You might want to try that again," he said. "With the right person." The champagne flutes shattered. Every head turned. And Jonah, standing 15 feet away, watched with an expression I didn't know how to read. Not anger, not surprise, something more complicated than either. The man I'd kissed took a sip of his drink and didn't look away from my face. His name, I learned approximately 4 minutes later, when Catherine Voss materialized at my elbow with a composed smile and the practiced efficiency of someone who has managed social disasters her entire adult life, was Sawyer, Jonah's older brother. He'd been living in Seattle for 6 years, overseeing the West Coast expansion, Catherine said, as though that explained everything, and had flown in that afternoon for the party. Jonah never mentioned him, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. They have a complicated history, Catherine said. But he's here now, and he's very glad to celebrate you both. She said this with the warmth of someone closing a topic of conversation. I found Jonah by the windows, looking out at the city lights. You have a brother, I said. He turned around. The complicated expression from across the room had settled into something flatter, more controlled. I do, you never told me. I know. He set his drink down on the windowsill. I was going to, before the wedding, obviously. Sawyer and I aren't close. We haven't been for a long time. He's at our engagement party, Jonah. My mother invited him. I didn't know she'd actually told him. He ran a hand through his hair, the one gesture he had that was purely unguarded. I'm sorry. I should have told you. I didn't want to get into all of it before we'd even set a date. There's a lot of history there. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to ask what kind of history, and why 6 years in Seattle, and what exactly the expression on his had meant when he watched me kiss his brother's cheek in the middle of 200 people. But his mother reappeared to pull us both toward a group that needed to toast us, and the moment dissolved, and I filed it away in the place where I kept things I intended to come back to. I met Sawyer formally 30 minutes later. Catherine orchestrated it with the same practiced smile, steering us toward each other near the dessert table, like she was correcting a mistake she'd decided to absorb rather than acknowledge. Sloane, he said. Just my name, like he was testing the weight of it. Sawyer. I kept my voice level. I apologize for earlier. I thought you were Jonah. I know you did. He picked up a small plate, examined the options. It was an honest mistake. You two haven't been together long enough for you to notice the differences. There was nothing overtly rude about the sentence, but something in the way he said it, the precision of long enough, the implication tucked inside the differences, made me feel like I'd been assessed and filed away in a category I hadn't agreed to. We've been together 2 years, I said. He took a piece of dark chocolate. He looks like me from a distance, especially if you're not paying attention. I was paying attention. Sure you were. He smiled then, and it was a different thing entirely from Jonah's smile. Jonah's was open and easy and immediate. Sawyer's was like watching a door open 2 inches to let in exactly the amount of light it intended. Congratulations on the engagement. He walked away. I stood there holding a champagne flute and felt, inexplicably, like I'd lost an argument I hadn't known I was having. The next morning I Googled him. Sawyer Voss, 41, 3 years older than Jonah. He'd left Philadelphia at 35, not long after a project he'd been leading, for Voss Properties, had collapsed in a very public way. I found a series of business articles about it, dry and financial in tone, but underneath the language about restructuring and board-level decisions was the clear shape of something more personal. Sawyer had made a call that cost the family company $40 million, and had apparently been invited to go find somewhere else to make his calls after that. The Seattle operation had done well under him, from what I could find. He'd rebuilt something out there quietly, but he hadn't come back. Not for holidays, from what Jonah had let slip in the car on the way home. I think he was in Aspen for Christmas, I don't know. We don't really talk. Not for anything until now. I thought about the way he'd watched me across the room, the way he hadn't stepped back. I closed the browser and went to meet Jonah for brunch. Over the next 3 months, Sawyer was present in the way that a low-grade sound is present. Not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough that you start noticing when it stops. He hadn't gone back to Seattle. Jonah mentioned it neutrally, the way he mentioned things he didn't want to discuss. Sawyer's taking a few months. I think he's looking at some properties here. He said it over dinner one night, with the careful nonchalance of someone who has decided not to feel a feeling they are absolutely feeling. Does that bother you? I asked. Why would it bother me? He picked up his fork. I let it go. I was good at letting things go with Jonah. He was good at most things, but the interior landscape of his relationship with his brother was clearly a place where he needed the lights off and the door closed, and I respected that in the way you respect someone's right to their own damage. Everyone had rooms they kept locked. I saw Sawyer 3 more times before everything changed. Once at a family dinner at the Voss house in Chestnut Hill, a 4-story Victorian that had been in the family since the 40s, where he arrived late and sat at the far end of the table and spoke mostly to Randall about something to do with a mixed-use development in Fishtown. He acknowledged me with a nod when he sat down and didn't look at me again all evening, which I told myself was fine and probably better. Once when I stopped by Jonah's office to drop off lunch and found Sawyer already there, standing at the window in the same posture I'd noticed at the party, very still, like someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as necessary, and not a centimeter more. They'd been in the middle of something when I knocked. The silence when I opened the door had a particular texture to it. Sawyer said hi, Sloane without quite meeting my eyes, and left within 2 minutes, and Jonah was quieter than usual the rest of that afternoon, and once at a fundraiser for an architecture conservancy that I attended with a colleague, where I turned from a conversation near the silent auction tables and found him standing 6 feet away, looking at a framed photograph of the old Litt Brothers building on Market Street. "You're here for work?" I asked, because it was easier than standing in silence. "My mother's on the board. I'm here as a favor." He glanced at me sideways. "You? I run the grant program for a preservation nonprofit. This is basically work." He looked back at the photograph. "You know this building? Litt Brothers. 1893, cast iron facade, demolished in the 60s. I'd written a paper on it in grad school. One of the great crimes of the urban renewal era." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, just a fraction of an opening. "The city lost more buildings to urban renewal in 20 years than it did in the previous century. 1,200 structures in Philadelphia alone," I said. "Most of them couldn't be replaced because we'd stopped teaching the trades needed to build them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who's funding your grant program right now?" 2 private foundations and a federal historic preservation grant we reapply for every 3 years. I paused. "Why?" "Voss Properties is looking at a community investment angle for the Fishtown project. It might be relevant." He said it the way he said most things, precise without obvious warmth, but not unkind. "I'll have someone send you information." "Okay," I said. I waited for the door open 2 inches smile. It didn't come this time. He just nodded and moved toward another part of the room. The information arrived in my work email 2 days later. It was a genuine lead, professionally presented. I forwarded it to my executive director and didn't tell Jonah about the conversation. I didn't examine why I didn't tell him. I just didn't. The thing about Jonah is that he was everything he appeared to be. I need to be honest about that, because what happened later can make it seem like I was waiting for an exit, like I'd been unhappy all along and just needed something to surface it. That's not true. Jonah was real and good, and I wasn't performing anything when I was with him. But there's a version of comfort that can, over time, start to feel like a ceiling rather than a foundation, where the ease of it means you stop pushing at the edges of yourself, where you can see exactly how the next 30 years will unfold, not in a bad way, just in a way, and you realize that the shape of your future has become so predictable that you've stopped being curious about it. I didn't name that feeling for a long time. I didn't want to name it. The night of the Voss family anniversary dinner, Randall and Catherine's 35th, Jonah got called away before dessert. A construction emergency. A contractor threatening to walk off a site in Delaware County at 9 in the evening because of a payment dispute that apparently couldn't wait. He kissed my forehead and apologized, and I told him to go. Because that was true. It was fine, I meant it. Sawyer was still at the table. Most of the other guests drifted toward the living room. We ended up at the same end of the largely empty table, with coffee cups and the remnants of a chocolate torte. And the conversation started the way conversations do when 2 people are the only ones left in a room, cautiously, about nothing, and then suddenly about something. "How did you end up in preservation?" he asked. I told him about my grandmother's house in Lancaster County. a 19th century farmhouse that had been in the family for 4 generations and was sold after she died because none of her children wanted the maintenance costs. I was 14 when it happened. I watched them auction off the contents of every room and then sign over the deed to a developer who tore the whole thing down within 18 months to build a subdivision. I had never fully recovered from it, I said, and then felt slightly embarrassed for saying it like that, so directly. That's not dramatic, he said, as though he'd read the embarrassment. That's a real loss. Those houses hold memory in the walls. When they're gone, the memory is gone. That's exactly it, I said, and then stopped, because it was exactly it, the thing I'd been trying to articulate for 15 years. And he'd said it in one sentence. He told me about a warehouse conversion project in Seattle, a 1920s cold storage facility in the Soto district that he'd spent 2 years fighting to preserve against internal pressure to demolish and build new. He'd won. It was now mixed-use residential with the original brick and timber interior intact, and he talked about it the way people talk about things they fought for and didn't lose. Jonah told me the Seattle project was a redemption arc, I said, before I could stop myself. He went very still. Then, is that what he called it? It wasn't a question. I felt the clumsiness of what I'd said and tried to walk it back. I don't think he meant. He probably meant exactly what he said. Sawyer refilled his coffee. Jonah's usually precise. He paused. The situation here, the one that sent me to Seattle, it was my fault. I made a decision that I believed in, and I was wrong, and it cost the company significantly. That's accurate. Whether or not it required 6 years of self-imposed exile is a separate question, but... He stopped. Nobody asked me to leave. I want to be clear about that. I chose to go. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. The thing about a mistake at that scale, he said slowly, is that it teaches you how to read a room. You stop moving fast. You learn to wait and watch before you commit. He looked at his coffee cup. It's a useful skill, mostly. It also makes people find you cold. I thought you were cold when I met you, I said. I know, I don't think you are now. He looked up. That 2-inch opening, but wider this time, and then it closed again, and he said, You should probably get back to Jonah. He's in Delaware County, dealing with a contractor situation. He'll be done soon. He stood, picking up his cup. He doesn't like to leave you alone for long. I noticed, he said, and not you. I stayed in my chair for a minute after he walked toward the kitchen, and I thought about what it meant that I'd noticed the difference. And then I thought about how I hadn't told Jonah about the conversation at the Conservancy fundraiser, and the work email I'd forwarded without mentioning where it came from. Small omissions. Not lies, just things I'd kept. I drove home alone that night and sat in my parking spot with the engine off for a long time, in the dark. I told Jonah I needed to talk to him on a Sunday morning in March. I'd been rehearsing it for 2 weeks, which meant I'd been rehearsing it longer than that, really. Just without the conscious label. He listened the way Jonah always listened, fully present, without interrupting, with the quality of attention that had first made me fall for him. That almost undid me. I sat across from him in our kitchen and said that I loved him, which was true, and that I wasn't sure I was in love with him anymore, in the way a person needs to be to build a life together, and that I had been feeling this for longer than I wanted to admit, and that I was so sorry. He was quiet for a very long time. Is this about Sawyer? He finally asked. The question landed differently than I expected. Not are you leaving me for him, not accusatory. Just the question, open, like he'd been waiting to ask it and had finally found the moment. I don't know, I said, because that was honest. I don't think it's about Sawyer. I think he made me look at something I'd been not looking at. Jonah nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee mug, set it down without drinking. I've known for a while that something was off, he said. I kept waiting for it to get better on its own. He gave a short, humorless exhale. That's not great conflict resolution on my part. Jonah, no, it's true. He looked at me steadily. I'm angry. I want to be honest with you. I am angry, and I'm going to be angry for a while. But I also know you, and I know you wouldn't be saying this if you weren't certain. He stood up. I think you should stay with a friend for a few days while I figure out what I want the next step to look like. He was decent about it. Even in that moment, he was decent about it. It broke my heart. I stayed with my friend Cassidy in Rittenhouse Square for a week. I didn't contact Sawyer. I want to be clear about that. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't text him. I didn't manufacture a reason to see him. I had ended my engagement because of a feeling I couldn't ignore any longer, and the feeling had existed before I could put a name to it. And I was not going to compound whatever I'd already caused by running toward the thing I might have been running from Jonah toward. I got coffee by myself. I went to work. I cried in the parking garage on a Wednesday. I was honest with my therapist for the first time in about 6 months. 3 weeks after I moved out, Sawyer called me. I stared at my phone for 4 rings. "I heard," he said when I picked up. No preamble. "Word travels fast in the Voss family," Catherine called me. A pause. "I'm sorry, for whatever role I played in." "You didn't play a role," I said. "I made a decision. You were something that helped me see a thing I'd been not seeing. Those are different." Silence on the line. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not now, not this week. When enough time has passed that it doesn't feel like when it feels appropriate. How will you know when that is?" "I'll ask Jonah," he said. I laughed. "It surprises both of us, I think." The sound of it, sudden and real. "Okay," I said. We went to dinner in early May. A small Italian place in Bella Vista that he'd been going to for 20 years, owned by a family that had operated out of the same row house since 1987. He knew the owner's daughter by name. She teased him about his order, and he absorbed it with something close to patience. It was the most relaxed I'd seen him. We talked for 3 hours, about the Fishtown project, about the grant program, about the Lancaster County farmhouse and the specific grief of losing a place that holds your history, about the warehouse in Seattle, about the version of himself he'd been before the $40 million mistake, which he described with the same directness he applied to everything. Younger, faster, less careful, probably more fun at parties. "And now?" I asked. "Now I move slowly," he said, "and I watch before I commit." The corner of his mouth lifted. That door, slightly open. "With some exceptions." "What are the exceptions?" He looked at me directly across the table. "The exceptions are when the thing in front of me is more interesting than the risk of getting it wrong." My face did something I couldn't control. I looked down at my wine glass. "Sloane," he said. "I know," I said. "Do you?" I looked up. "I kissed you by accident at my engagement party." "You did, and then everything fell apart. Or came together," he said, "depending on how you look at it. It wasn't smooth from there. I want to be accurate about this. Jonah needed distance for longer than any of us had hoped, and there were months where Sawyer and I kept things careful and slow out of respect for that. The Voss family processed everything in the private way. Wealthy families process difficult things. Not outwardly, not loudly, just with doors that sometimes didn't open when they used to. Catherine was warm to me in the careful way of someone who hadn't yet decided how to categorize the situation. Randall was cordial in a way I suspected he applied to most things. But Jonah called me in August. He was direct and not unkind, the way he'd always been. He said he was doing well. He said he'd been seeing someone, briefly, and it was too early to know, but she made him laugh. He said, and I'll remember this exactly, "I don't forgive the timing of it, Sloane, but I understand the why. I think I knew the why before you did. I didn't know what to say to that." "Take care of yourself," he said. "And tell Sawyer," I said. He stopped. "Tell him I said nothing. We'll get there eventually." We hung up. I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time. They did get there, eventually, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular awkward tentativeness of 2 brothers, who had been too stubborn and too far apart for too many years, and were trying to figure out how to stand in the same room again. I wasn't at the center of it. That part was between them, and it needed to be. I moved into Sawyer's apartment in Fairmount the following spring. It was the top floor of a converted 1904 warehouse, brick walls and original timber ceiling, big industrial windows that let in the kind of light that makes everything look like the best version of itself in the late afternoon. The morning after I brought the last of my boxes, I stood in the kitchen in his flannel shirt making coffee, while he sat at the table going through work emails, and the particular quality of the silence between us, easy, inhabited, like something that had been a long time finding its shape, made me think about my grandmother's farmhouse, about memory in walls, about the things you fight to preserve and what it costs you, and whether it's worth it. I thought about a night a year and a half ago. Marble floors, champagne flutes shattering, 200 people turning to look at me. 3 seconds. "Hey," Sawyer said, without looking up from his laptop. You're doing the thing where you're thinking about something and not saying it. I poured a second mug of coffee and set it beside him. How do you always know? He looked up then, the door wide open. Because I pay attention, he said. I've paid attention to you since the night you kissed me by accident in front of everyone you knew. That is an embarrassing legacy. It's your origin story. He turned back to his laptop. Wear it better. I sat down across from him with my coffee and thought that I probably would.